But for this hour, we have the Logbook Project with our longtime Zoom friends here, Lars McKee, who's joining us from Sweden, and Nick Devaux, who's joining us from St. Lucia.
Hey,
Hello,
Todd, how are you?
Hi, Todd.
Good to see you both.
Good to be on. Thanks for letting us be on.
How about Kurt's story, Kurt Leuchter's story? I mean, oh
Yeah.
my goodness.
How about that, Todd? Thanks a lot. Yeah.
You have a heart, yeah.
Like really, Todd. Like we're supposed to come on here now, and like really, Todd. Thank you so much. Why don't you just go to the next segment? Oh my God!
It's so true, Nick. It's so true. It's like, hey, Nick, I love you, Nick, and I love you, Lars. But like, why don't you just sign off and let's keep talking to Kurt, okay?
Keep going. There's nothing to see here, honestly.
Just move on.
Well, I do welcome you. We will reluctantly move on to Nick and Lars and the Logbook Project, which I believe, if it's not in the Guinness Book of World Records, it will be, or certainly could be eligible for it. Is the logbook the most mailed item in history?
Well, that's what we would like to believe. I put in an application. We'll see what happens. Who knows? Yeah, I mean, technically, it could be the most unaccompanied travel document in the world. There's a case to be made for that. It's not the most traveled document, because if you think of ship logs and maybe something up in space that's orbiting the Earth, we could never compete. But there might be a slot where it's the most unaccompanied, moved around document. So we'll see.
And I'm going to put the website, the link here to the Logbook Project, so people can click on it and find out a little bit more. But why don't you give people who aren't familiar with the Logbook Project a little explanation of what it is?
So that's exactly what Lars is about to do.
If you give me co-host, I can do that.
Got it. Yeah. How are you, Lars?
I'm not doing too bad. It's
good.
Chiming in with Nick, it's going to be hard to kind of follow up from.
Unbelievable.
Oh, I'm having trouble finding here the permission to make you. Let me see if I can to make you co-host. Do you know why? Because I'm not host.
No, you're a co-host. Sean, is you on? You're the host.
I think Sean has to make you. Oh boy. Okay, so what you could do. All right, I could share my screen. So Lars, if you want to email me or put in the chat your presentation, I could share, because I can't make you co-host. I do not have that power.
Okay.
Right. I'll let Lars do that. While Lars is doing that, if Henry is with us, I just want to show him something. Oh, is this too blurred out?
Yeah, there it is. Logbook Project.
Right. So Henry, if you can hear me, when I was in Japan and I met with, oops, man, this keeps getting blurred out. Right. I met with Mr. Shigeaki Mori, and I got him to autograph this card for you. So I owe this to you, Henry, and I will be sending this to you. He signed it himself with me. So remind me to do that. I've been carrying it around with me for a year since I got back from Japan. So I owe that to you. Anyway, let me just, while you guys are sorting that out, let me let the viewers know what we're all about. So my dad was a pilot in the Second World War. And fortunately for me, by the time he got over to Europe, the war was really winding up, so that he didn't actually go into combat, thankfully, because I probably wouldn't be here talking to you if he had. But he certainly was a fully qualified pilot. Towards the end there, he actually signed up with the Fleet Air Arm, the British Fleet Air Arm, and in the hopes of joining the invasion of Japan, which never occurred, thankfully, again. But as a result of that, he had his pilot's logbook, which chronicled his every single flight that he did, first in Canada and then over in England. And I've just always been fascinated with that document, which is the one we were talking about sending all over. And then about in 2016, I saw a story about a Japanese pilot named Mr. Kaname Harada. He had been at Midway, he had been at Pearl Harbor, although he had to stay with the carriers. He was a very accomplished pilot. And I thought, wouldn't it be a great idea if he could sign the logbook? So I had a friend in Japan who had agreed to help me. I sent the book off to him. Unfortunately, Mr. Harada passed away before he could sign it. He was 99 years old. But then I thought, well, there must be somebody else in Japan who could sign this. And at the time, President Obama was making a speech at Hiroshima. And you can Google that. There's a photo of him in an embrace with a gentleman called Shigeaki Mori. And Mr. Mori was a 10-year-old schoolboy on the way to school when the atom bomb was dropped on the 6th of August. And he survived that by falling into a river. But he lived through that whole Armageddon. And years later, when the Japanese built a memorial with every single name of the casualties, he felt that there were some American POWs in Japan. And he could see them from his school because his dad worked as a police officer. And these men were being kept at the police station. And Mr. Mori dedicated his life to discovering the names of these six or seven POWs. And he spoke no English. And this is at a time before the internet. But he, over, I think, about 20, 25 years, found all the families, was able to tell them how their nephews, sons, whatever, had passed away. And now the American names now are part of that memorial. So he, talk about an experience and just an incredible human being. And I was fortunate enough to go all the way to Japan last year to meet with him at his home. My wife and I went, and that's the card I was holding up earlier. He signed, and Henry, I'm sending that to you. It's long overdue, but Todd will remind me.
I will.
So I'm hoping, do you have the presentation by now?
Oh, here we go. Here we go. It looks like I do. Yes, I do.
Okay.
Here it is. Oh, this is great. Okay, hold on a second. Let me just get it.
There's two of them. So he's sending you his own, and then mine should follow shortly. But if you get his up and running,
Okay.
We have some exciting. So just to finish off that story. So when Mr. Shigeaki Mori signed the book, at that point, I thought, my goodness me, that's just one story. I think as your previous presenter said, about over millions that are out there. And that was 2016. And I have spent since then sending this book around the world. And that's why we're having the conversation about if it is the most unaccompanied travel document. And we have over just about 250 signatures in the logbook now. There it is. So with that as an intro, I will hand over to Lars.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, and Nick, you covered it very well so far. So, I mean, the Logbook project, we've been honored to be featured on the Veterans Breakfast Club a few times already. So I'm not going to go into too much of the details, but it's just basically, as Nick has pretty much outlined, it's a global journey of an RAF pilot's logbook, collecting firsthand accounts of veterans and witnesses from all sides of World War II. And the way we do it is by asking them to sign a page of the logbook as a, for posterity and as a token of remembrance. So yeah, if you take next slide then, Todd, hope it all's gonna work out. So the logbook, as you can see, it's basically belonged to Nick's father, Cyril Devaux, who's on the right, and just an excerpt of the logbook page from some of his flights in a Seafire. That's actually post-war flights, training flights. So yeah, you can take the next slide then, Todd. And obviously, this whole thing, the logbook obviously came back with Nick's father and was kept within the family as a heirloom. It kind of then, I would say, inspired Nick then. I'm not going to kind of speak for you, of course, Nick, but a madman's idea then eventually turned into something, inspired him to do something else. So if you just take the next slide then. And I'm speeding up a little.
Oh my gosh, how great.
This in the background is really just a map because we track where the book is going and where it's been. So, and this is a very blurry map of it, but it's you can zoom in, but I wanted to capture as much of the world as possible. So what you're seeing is every star on this map is representing a signature, and every line is basically where it's traveled to the details. And to date, I think we're about over 330,000 miles. It's 328,000 there, but that's when I did the presentation. There's over 240 signatures in that logbook right now, spanning over 21 different nationalities. So the metrics, as you start summarizing them, is becoming quite, to me, very incredible. And I mean, obviously, we're mentioning facilitators all over the world, because this is obviously would not have been possible without good-hearted people like yourself, Todd, who actually is responsible for a few signatures in this.
That's right. That's right.
Lars,
yeah, you can take. Yeah,
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I love maps. I really just love looking at maps. And this one, it just strikes me looking at this map, how apropos the Logbook project is for covering the story of World War II, because World War II, among other things, was the largest single event in human history. If you count the war in Asia and the war in Europe together as one thing, the largest event involving more people in more places than anything else in history. It truly was a global war. And your logbook, I mean, you don't show Asia here in this map, but your logbook has traveled to so many of the places where the war was fought.
I mean, in every signature, obviously, this is just the location where the signature happened. So the veteran or the witness, could have served somewhere else, but it kind of gives you an idea. And I mean, yes, there are Asia and Australia is actually on this map as well, but it didn't fit.
Yeah, right. Jeez, that's amazing. 328,705 miles traveled to date.
And mind you, that's since Nick started it. That's when Nick, started to send it off. So prior to that, obviously it traveled, in Canada, and then over to the UK, and then back to, whatever travels it did with Mr. Cyril Devaux.
Right.
So, yeah, you can take the next slide. So,
and this is I'm sorry. We have FedEx Ground as our sponsor. It seems to me that maybe you should find a sponsor that's a global shipping company.
I was just going to say, maybe you can put us into contact with them.
That's right.
Thank you for that plug. It would be a great.
That's right.
You know what? I do want to shout out the U.S. Postal Service, because people, it's so funny. People in every country, people are like, "How are you sending that thing? I hope you're not putting it in the post." And I'm like, well, actually, yes, we are. I mean, we use tracking and so on.
Yes.
But the U.S. Post, I gotta say, they have been excellent. They have. I mean, once or twice they'll take a scenic route, and it takes a little longer to get there. But no, man, it's been great. Anyway, let me not take time, but yeah.
No. And here's another thing about the project, Nick and Lars, is that trust that you do put in people like me, who we've never met. You don't know me from Adam. I mean, we've known we've known each other for years by correspondence and over Zoom, but we've never met in person. And yet you send me the logbook and you trust that I'm going to be able to get signatures and send it back to you or send it on to another veteran. For signature.
I'm not gonna lie, Todd. I have many sleepless nights still. Nick can attest to that. So, but I'm getting there. I'm putting more faith into the book. But yeah, no.
Jim Belcher puts in the chat here, an amazing project. I'm in awe. Ironically, I've held it 2 different times. I read almost every entry. Honored to be a very small part of the logbook. You preserve the signer's legacies. Wonderful, Jim.
I'm really happy that you're on, Jim. Hang tight. So if you take the next slide then, Todd.
Yeah, let's get to the slide.
So the next 2 slides is just basically what I wanted to do with these is just take some of our signatories and put them into the greater context of World War II. The images that we're looking at right now is probably, it speaks to you. They're very, I was about to say iconic, but maybe that's the wrong word in the context, but they're very well known. The Arizona sinking in Pearl Harbor, Omaha Beach, and so on. So just take the next picture, which is the same. If you just next slide.
Oh, next slide. Okay.
Yeah. Which is also, same thing. It's very well-known pictures. So let's try and just put them a few examples into some of our signatories. So if you take the next slide. And the history buffs will immediately recognize this as the B-25 Mitchell bomber in April 1942, taking off the USS Hornet for the Doolittle raid, which was basically, the first, I don't know, they poked the bear, I guess, in a way. So in this picture, you have Jimmy Doolittle in the left-hand seat as the pilot. In the right-hand seat, you have the co-pilot. So if you take the next slide.
And boom. Isn't that awesome?
The gentleman signing the logbook here is Mr. Devaux, Richard Devaux, which is basically Jimmy Doolittle's co-pilot. So in this picture, taking off from the Hornet, is this gentleman. And I mean, once you start taking that in and start digesting it, it's, you know, I think probably this is probably the most, you know, that pops and kind of hits you. But obviously, I mean, every single story, every single signatory is unique in their own way, with your very unique connection to World War II. But if you take the next slide, you just, you know, I have a few examples of this. So if you take the next, same thing. This is another iconic picture. If you want it, it's called the Into the Jaws of Death. This is probably one of the most known pictures of Omaha Beach. It's taken from by, I wrote it down, Robert F. Sargent. It's taken from a Higgins boat that he's on. This is soldiers from the first, U.S. Army 1st Infantry Division landing on Omaha Beach. It's taken about 7:40 a.m. on D-Day as they are landing on Omaha Beach. Taking the next slide. At that time, when this picture is taken, Mr. Bill Parker is already ashore. I mean, he's in front of these guys somewhere trying to, I guess, do what he was doing. So that's another signatory that when you start looking at their individual story and putting them in the larger context, it's just sort of, it just, you know, it grips you.
And I just want to say, Ed Cottrell just joined us. He's 101 years old, P-47 pilot. He's in the Zoom room here with us. I got to talk to him this weekend. He was in Pittsburgh, and I got to talk to him. Just now that we're talking about these, you know, heroes of World War II, we have one in the Zoom room here with us.
Yeah,
Ed is one of our signatories.
Also a signatory.
Yes, and he's a signatory.
So I can't see you, Ed, because I'm on the slide, but hey, Ed, again.
Hi, Ed.
So anyway, another slide. This is the USS Mississippi, which is I'm wearing the hat of. Basically, it's her last dying moments, keeling over before she sinks into the lagoon of Ulithi Lagoon. So if you take the next slide. This is then obviously it was the logbook is signed by Mr. Mike Mayer, whose father was John Jack Mayer, who was a survivor of the Mississippi sinking in the Ulithi. Next slide. And I'm speeding things up here. Again, this is USS Comfort H-86, which was a hospital ship, which just standing off of Okinawa in April of 1945, she's hit by a kamikaze. Not sure whether they're actually aiming for the cross, but it did hit the ship, and it killed, was it 28 people and over 40 casualties or injured. Just take the next slide. And Doris Howard, First Lieutenant Doris Howard, was a U.S. Army nurse. She was on the ship. And as the kamikaze slammed into the ship, she was just thrown clear of her feet into a bulkhead and, you know, injured herself quite badly, but she survived. And she signed, and she ended her, you know, her entry saying no more war. And that's a pretty profound message to us. Next slide. We're not just doing, you know, the Allied side. We're collecting accounts from all sides of the conflict. This is Kazuo Odachi, who was a A6M0 kamikaze pilot, who obviously survived the war. I was about to say not from lack of trying, but he was on like 8 different missions. They all got funneled. His last mission was basically at the time they were taking off for a last do or die mission, but as they were trying to take off, somebody came running down the runway and basically stopped them and said, "You got to listen. The emperor's going to speak on the radio." So they went to speak on the radio, and that's when the war ended. So he was just minutes away from last. So he's a signature, and also I don't know where you are in this picture, Nick, but you're in the room when he's signing the logbook right there. I don't know
So,
exactly what.
I was privileged enough to visit Japan last year, and the garb that he is wearing, he is a kendo teacher. This 97 or 8-year-old man at the time, his movements are as youthful and graceful as any martial arts practitioner that you will see. And I was treated to a demonstration where he weaved it's what they call a kendo sword. It's made out of bamboo, I think. But just incredible agility in this gentleman. So that was part of my trip over, and I got to, as Lars says, I got to witness that signing. It was a surreal moment, just phenomenal. Thanks.
And the next slide.
All right, hold on a
I think
second.
we should probably start coming up to the.
I'm going to stop
The
it
end of
just
it.
for a second to redo it. I believe Marguerite is in the house, is in the Zoom room. Just in
Wow,
case.
is she with us? Wow.
I think she is. Marguerite Woodstock Riley.
Yes.
Oh yeah,
Yes.
she's needs
She's
to be
with us,
unmuted though.
joining us from Barbados, I believe.
Yes. Oh,
I'm
my
going to
goodness.
ask her to unmute. Marguerite is the oldest. Well, you introduce her.
Hi, Margaret.
Yes, hi.
Oh, so lovely of you to join us.
Say hi, Mom. Yes.
So joining us now is 106-year-old Ina Woodstock, Ina Collymore Woodstock, I beg your pardon. You are looking at the oldest female British Army veteran. Do I have that right, Marguerite?
Yes, yes, that's right.
I just met her in person in Barbados last week as well. Marguerite left from Jamaica originally, went over to England as part of the ATA, and arrived. She took a convoy, and we're going to talk
Marguerite,
about.
Ina.
Sorry, Ina. Oh, I beg your pardon. Ina went over.
I'm not that old. Yeah.
And she was part of the convoy. She went across, and when she arrived, they put her in a typing pool, and she announced that she had not come all that way to type. Whereupon she was then deployed to a radar unit in Belgium, in Brussels. And we're still delving into her story, but she then went on to have a storied career in the legal profession. Obviously had to face all the colors of, all the barriers of sexism and race, and overcome all the foolish things that people put as barriers. And she blazed too many trails to count. And she ended up as a judge, a barrister, has a storied legal profession in Jamaica. On top of all her philanthropy work, we are witnessing history in this lady. Her family legacy lives on. Marguerite and her daughters, they are all in the legal profession, and it's such an honor to introduce you all. Thank you so much for joining us. I should add, she's a logbook.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hearing you.
Marguerite, thank you so much for joining us. What an honor it is to be, again, just sharing this time a little bit with your mother, Ina. 106 years old. It has to be one of the oldest veterans of World War II generally, and certainly in the British Army.
Thank you. All right, Lars, I think we can pick back up again. We will.
Yeah, I mean, Todd, if you could just sort of, I mean, this one is also a bit profound. I mean, we're basically saying it's to the epicenter of history.
This is an important slide because this is Mr. Mori, who I mentioned at the beginning. So he was a gentleman who, after Mr. Harada passed away, I found, and graciously he signed the book, and he's the very first logbook signatory. Oh. And we were fortunate enough to meet him, and his wife is also a survivor of the August 6th bombing in Hiroshima. They still live in Hiroshima. If you look at the black and white picture and the hills behind the building, they live up on the hills there a little bit. And so the day before we left Hiroshima, I got up so early and I had the book with me and I ran around, and that picture on the left is just a moment that I had there as the sun was coming up. It was gorgeous. Oh. But so, so that's another thing, is that being able to place the book at some of these historic spots too has been so rewarding. But so I'm just looking, and here, of course, sorry, Lars, you take it.
Yeah, no, and I mean it's just also we mentioned some of the Holocaust. We have several Holocaust signatories in there, and it's, you know, what
Yeah.
can you say? I mean, it's we just heard some of it. There's I just have nothing more to add. It's just, yeah. This is yeah. And again, I mean, one of the more you know, profound pictures. You got the sinking Arizona. Donald Stratton is one is a signatory. He climbed off. I'm not going to go into the details, but he climbed off the Arizona as she was burning. You know, from one of the. It was actually circled in another picture that I showed. So,
Yeah.
yeah. So I think we probably three candidate. Yep. So this is Mr. Vito Alonghi. He was actually atop the USS Missouri. And I know, Jeff, I know you were in there somewhere watching. Your grandfather is on the ship somewhere here as well, because Conrad F. Castillo, who we have actually been on Veterans Breakfast Blog talking about, is on the Missouri somewhere. He was a steward to Admiral Halsey. So, but anyway, Mr. Vito Alonghi is atop the turret. He's circled there in red. So basically, you Donald Stratton and Vito Alonghi are signed the same page. Yeah. Now, this is where it gets a bit profound. Jim, you're probably in here as well, and you're watching. So, Nick, you probably need to help me out a little bit here.
Okay. Yeah, let me, okay, if you don't mind, I'll do this. So early on, when I first started with the moving the book around, one of the few stories that I was familiar with was the story of the Indianapolis. I don't know why, but anyway, I knew that there was a ship, it had been sunk, and I knew that the men spent 3 days in the water. That's about all I knew, but I knew that. Maybe it was from Jaws, but so I always knew, look, that's one story that I want definitely to get a signature from. And so I started looking around, and soon enough, very kindly, Mr. Edgar Harrell agreed that he would sign the logbook. And we sent the book off to him. And up in the top right there, you can see he signed quite prominently there in the dark ink. And that was it. You know, that was as much as I knew of the story. And I mean, that in itself was amazing, but that's as much as I knew at the time. And then as time went by, I started to think, well, hang on a minute. There was a submarine involved in this, you know, and what's that story? What's that about? So I started prodding and poking, because by then my Japanese sort of network had expanded a little bit. And then lo and behold, yes, I found out that there were two gentlemen from, it's called the I-58, that were still alive, which led me to the story of the Kaiten. When Lars showed a slide earlier with Mr. Mike Mayer and the Mississinawa, which is the hat that he's wearing. The Mississinawa was an oiler, and the Japanese towards the end of the war had developed basically kamikaze versions of submarines. But the difference was, unlike Mr. Odachi, who's still alive and with us, because if the kamikazes went out and for whether engine trouble, weather, lack of targets, they could come back. When they sealed you into a Kaiten torpedo, that was it. There was no coming out. Once you sat in that structure and sealed yourself in, you were dead. And so the Kaiten sank the Mississinawa, but there were Kaiten on the I-58 that sank the Indianapolis. And so, and on the night when the Indy was spotted by the I-58, the Kaiten were actually very, they really wanted to have a shot at her. But the Kaiten were designed for in-harbor, calm areas. And Hashimoto, I think, is the captain of I-58. He said, look, I didn't need it. It was an easy, they were sitting ducks. I couldn't miss. And he fired off the torpedoes. The ship went down in 12 minutes. So anyway, long story. So it was through Mr. Mike Mayer, who introduced me to the Kaiten Museum, people who keep that legacy alive, who then in turn introduced me to Mr. Kiyozumi, who you see on the bottom left. And they got him to first sign the book. It was in January, I think, of 21, that he just signed. So here I had the signatures of these two men. Mr. Edgar Harrell, and Mr. Kiyozumi, Kunshiro Kiyozumi. Somewhere in the midst of all of that too, though, I read one day of Jim Belcher Jr.'s story online. And Jim Belcher is a story all by himself. And I know he's listening to me because he's working hard on a book that I keep bugging him about. Jim Belcher's father, Jim Sr., was also aboard the Indy and survived. They spent 3 days in the water. 900 men went into the water when she was torpedoed. And because it was on this top secret mission to deliver components of the atom bomb, nobody was looking for them. So they were not reported missing. And the search didn't start in earnest until about 2 days later, maybe. And so of the 900, 600 died because of shock attack and exposure. But Mr. Belcher Sr. survived all of that, went back to sea, got stationed in Japan, and fell in love with a Japanese woman named Toyoko Inu. And they got married and had 3 sons. Now, if that's not a mind-bending enough story.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, that, and so Jim Jr. is the first of the 3. He was actually born in Japan, but raised in the US. And Jim has devoted his life to telling people about the Indy legacy. So Jim has a separate page. We have a separate page for Jim, and his mother is a signatory. His father had died by the time I caught up with Jim, but Jim very kindly has inserted a signature from his dad in the book on another page.
Jim, I'm going to interrupt you here for just a
Sure.
second here. I've asked Jim to unmute himself just because I'm going to tell him that I'm going to join the chorus of Nick in bugging you about the book that you're writing. I'm assuming that you must be writing a story about your parents.
It's even bigger than that. It's my whole family. My Japanese side of my family. I tour the United States telling the Indy story, but it opens the door to one of the big things I think we need in this country and this world today, and that's the whole idea of tolerance and forgiveness.
Amen.
I grew up in a house that was clearly my mother and father married 46 years. Dad died of a heart attack in 2001. My mother never remarried, had no interest. And the day Dad died, after he died, my brothers and I approached her soon after and said, Mom, it's okay if you want to go home now. You've done your job. You've raised us. We have families, us boys. And I'll never forget her answer. She looked at us confused and she said, but I am home. And that's what I realized. She's American.
Jim, I don't need to tell you this, but when your parents were married, Nick, I promise I will get right back to you, but I'm just so struck that when your parents were married, Jim, there must have been millions or thousands of GIs, of veterans who were just perplexed. How in the world could your father be married to a Japanese woman?
Especially in light of the fact that the Japanese sank them. And he was in the water. They were in the water 5 days. And it wasn't until the 4th day they were spotted and rescued. He never talked much about his time in the water. I found out more after he was gone from some of the guys who were with him in the water. His story was amazing all in itself. And it took me a lifetime to figure it all out. I do need to write that book, Nick. I am starting on it. So, just hang around. It'll be done.
Good,
I
Jim.
promised you.
Listen, that is one story that a lot of people are waiting anxiously to read.
Well,
I mean, it's a love story, and that's a beautiful thing.
It is.
Love
It
in the
is.
midst of war is just amazing.
Yeah, it's overwhelming. And again, in today's world, I'm in schools all over the country, and I remind children that the word hate is overused today. I said, we have a lot of anger. There's anger in every country, in every part of the world now, at our governments, at the wars, at all of these. My dad he told me, he said, there's nothing good about war. He was in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam.
Oh,
So when it was my turn to go in the military, I clearly saw what happened to Dad's ship, and I said, well, I'm not going in the Navy. That's not a good ending. So I went in the Air Force, and I served my 4 years in the Air Force post-Vietnam. But I learned a lot. I learned a lot about my dad just serving 4 years in the U.S. military. So the family and my mother, I talk about my dad as a survivor of the Indianapolis, but my mother survived World War II. My grandfather was at Nagasaki.
Yep.
When the second bomb was dropped, Dad helped deliver the first bomb. And my uncle, Kazuhiro Inoue, sergeant in the Imperial Japanese Army. So when Mom brought Dad home to meet, her family, you can imagine what that was like in their
Can you
family.
imagine that?
And then Dad's from Alabama, little town Abbeville, Alabama. Picture 1957 when we all came back to the United States. I'm Japanese American, Japanese citizen at birth. And Dad brings us home to Abbeville, Alabama, which I got to tell you, there were 2 sailors on the Indianapolis from this tiny little town in Alabama, and the other guy did not survive. And so when Dad brought Mom home in 1957, again, imagine what it was like for my mother and me to show up in southeastern Alabama, following all that had happened in their town, little town, because of the Indianapolis and World War II. So, yeah, we grew up with a lot of the prejudices, I think, that America has that kind of outgrown. I've been a part of that. I've watched all my life. But I'm proud to say my mother endured it, and my father, you wouldn't think he would have to endure anything, but he sure did. And I feel like my dad said something to me one time that it's a part of my life. Whenever I was having a bad day, and he would remind me, he says, "You haven't had a bad day yet." And he's comparing it to what he knew was a bad day or days. So we have a lot to be grateful for in this country and in this world, and we need to start healing and practicing, this unconditional love, tolerance, and forgiveness. Those are such universal messages that we need to. I saw that one nurse, that there's nothing good about war. I mean, war, end all war. I wish there was a way. I wish there was a way.
Well, your book will help, and so that's why we're going to continue bugging you about the book.
Oh,
Amen.
Thank you.
the hell with the
Thank
book.
you.
We need a 12-episode documentary here.
That's right.
Well, I'd be happy anytime to share the story. So you all just ask. I'll do it.
I would love, Jim. I think I will be in touch because I would love to have you share that story because it's
I'm
your
more than
story.
welcome.
That's wonderful. Oh boy,
Yes.
How terrific!
Let's get back to the logbook. I'm interested in the logbook. This thing is a phenomenal project. It's impacted my life. I got to say, in some ways, it was the reason that I think is leading up to where Nick is going with yet another survivor of the Indianapolis being involved in this story of the logbook.
Indeed. So sorry, Lars, just go back one. Is it Todd?
Yeah, Todd.
Go back one slide. So yes, let me pick up from there. So on the bottom left, we have Mr. Kunshiro Kizumi. What he's actually doing there, that's after he had signed. He had already signed, and when I went back to Japan, I took the book with me, and I actually went and met this man. So I think maybe even I may have taken that photo. And while I was there sitting with him, I don't know how or why, but I suggested that he could draw a little sketch of the submarine. And so that photo in the bottom left of the slide is of him actually sketching in the submarine. So you see how this is building as it goes along. So all of a sudden I had Mr. Edgar Harrell, I had Mr. Kiyozumi's signature, I had the gentleman from the Kaiten Museum who had signed down below. So this page was really beginning to take a life of its own. And then somewhere after that was last November, I reached out to Jim, because all of a sudden there was the last survivor of the Indianapolis. I think there were 2 of them, and then one of the gentlemen died somewhere in between. And so all of a sudden, the last gentleman who's still alive, as far as I know, is Mr. Harold Bray. He lives out in California. And what's quite striking now, I think Mr. Bray was probably one of the youngest crew members aboard the ship. And his opposite, Mr. Kiyozumi, was also the youngest member of his crew. So I reached out to Jim and I said, Jim, would you help me approach Mr. Bray? And Jim absolutely jumped on board. And within faster than I could think, the book was off to Mr. Bray in California. And this was just at the same time when a statue to him has been dedicated in the city in which he lives. So that was a pretty cool moment. And so, yes, so now we have his signature in the book. So we have 2 of the Indies survivors, and we have Mr. Kiyozumi. And at the time, I asked his daughter if she could ask him to do a sketch, but she said, look, his hands aren't the best, so we didn't get a sketch. And I thought, and something about the sketch just kept bugging me. And then I thought, duh, I have the perfect sketch master right in my midst. And I said, Jim, would you do this? And Jim said, dude, I've been drawing sketches of the Indies since I was in school and getting a lot of crap for that. So I'll be happy to do it. So next slide, please. So this is, I think the ink might still be wet on the page because Jim, what day did you do this?
I did it, what is today? Today is Saturday. I think it was Wednesday. So this is not even 4 days old yet. And here you see, well, first of all, here's the Belcher legacy page on the left with the family photo. There's, that's your uncle there, right, Jim? On the right, and the bottom of that picture. That is his mom's signature. Yes, that's my uncle.
Right, and there's Mr. Belcher Senior's signature there on the yellow page, which Jim has stuck in there. I mean, that in itself is that we could be here all day with just that page alone. But then in the middle, there's Jim very carefully, and I noticed how sharp the pencil point was, Jim. That was awesome. And the backdrop is just what struck me, where he has the two models. There's the Indy, and there's I-58. There are his dad's medals. His dad's photo is there, maybe not so clear in that picture, but it is there. And so he sketched it in, and then with a pen that says the USS Indianapolis, he then outlined the boat. And it's such a gorgeous sketch. It's a piece of art in itself. So Lars, please make a note of the date, because I don't think Jim actually dated it, and I want to put that date on there. So that wraps up in completion the Indy I-58 page in the logbook. And I am still trying to wrap my head around all that is on that page. It's mind-blowing.
The history on that page.
Yeah.
The last two men from the submarine and the cruiser, actually, because of the logbook, I was able to put Harold Bray in touch with Mr. Kiyozumi. Harold wrote him a letter. And I had no idea. You know, I don't, with the survivors, I've helped them for years. I don't direct them. I just asked him, would you like to write a letter? And he did. He wrote a beautiful letter. And surprisingly, Mr. Kiyozumi felt the same way and wrote a letter back. And those two letters to me represent everything I'm talking about.
What did they say in those letters?
How much they admired each other, that they felt their age being so youthful, both of them, that they were both shared that as part of their stories, how much they felt respectful of each other, that the war was bad, both of them basically saying, you know, there's nothing good about war, and that they're both working hard towards making the world a peaceful and better place. And they have, as far as I know, both of them do. But the biggest part of the story with the letters, and if you read the exact letters, it's even more impactful, is that there's a bond between these two men now that would not have existed ever between the ship and the submarine had first the logbook come around, and then second, the opportunity to know and meet and talk to Mr. Kiyozumi, who I'd seen in the logbook, and realized that we needed to reach out to him because, as Nick had said, there were two survivors for quite a while from the I-58. And, you know, as all of us do, we put it off. And then suddenly there was one. And I knew then we have to do it now. Nick, you've probably been through this exercise a million times with all of these veterans. But if I didn't reach out to Mr. Kiyozumi now, it wouldn't happen. And ironically, I wrote him a letter. And I encouraged 3 other Indianapolis families. All the other 3 were lost at sea families. Now think of the impact of that. They lost a loved one in World War II. And I asked them, would you like to write a letter to Mr. Kiyozumi? And all 3 letters were loving and forgiving. And I didn't direct them. I just said, would you like to? And I actually had a person respond in a text message to me, a family member, and it was hurtful. I mean, they were still very hurt, and
Oh yeah.
and I, made the conscious decision that I would pass on the wonderful letters, and the one of all the families that I know and read this, I only had the one negative comment. The rest, these 3 letters are beautiful. I'll share them with anybody who wants to see them. But it kind of tells the story of where we are now with World War II. Japan is one of our strongest allies now, and there's tremendous amount of respect and forgiveness. And for those lost at sea families to say what they said just was surprising. Mr. Kiyazumi was blown away by the fact that an Indianapolis survivor married a Japanese woman. He did not know that. And I shared with him a little bit of my mother's stories. And I could tell how much it touched him that my father in particular certainly had forgiven the Japanese people over and over again. And he loved Japan. My dad, we were eating sushi before anybody in the United States was eating sushi that I knew of. So we brought our culture with us. My culture was a mixed culture in our house. We didn't exhibit it. And Dad had a thing about acclimating. We're in America. We're Americans, and we didn't speak Japanese growing up. We didn't read or write it, but we definitely learned the important parts of the culture. And I think I spent my whole lifetime with a blended sense of both Japanese and American cultures. And I think it's helped me in my life. I really do.
This is so wonderful. Lars and Nick, would you want to go back to the slideshow, or do you have other things you want to?
That was the introduction. That was the 5-minute introduction I intended to do.
That was your 5-minute introduction. Well, I'm looking at the clock. We have 12 minutes left.
No, you can stop right there, Todd. You don't need to go further here.
Okay.
Well, I mean,
there's, in other words, we've been just scratching the surface.
Absolutely. Todd, if you would mind pulling up the other project show, do you have it?
Oh, I do have it.
There are like 2 slides there that I would like to move on to, because I did want to touch on the U-boat war, which was part of why I asked Ina to join us today. And I'm so thrilled that she is there. I mean, what a remarkable person who lived through. And I guess this is all in keeping with the whole submarine theme as well. As you can see, you definitely need to get Jim back. Because that story that's the story that keeps on giving. That's the original Guess Who's Coming to Dinner story.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Okay, so I need to reformat this just a little bit just to get this. And so I'm going to share now.
So we'll go real quick, and I'll make this fit in the 10 minutes.
Okay.
Because I'm so happy actually that this happened. There are a lot. Part of the problem we face with this project is that's the wrong.
This is the wrong one.
Yeah. That's the wrong one. Part of the problem we face with this project is that it pulls us in literally 250 different directions, and if we're not careful, we can go down rabbit holes in a hurry, in a heartbeat.
The VET-A-THON, November 23, Rev 2-1, Todd.
So, and Lars, being the kind of person Lars is, I just have to drop a name, and then he's within 10 seconds.
Hang on a second, Todd.
10 files for me to read. So anyway, well, I'll just give the listeners a little bit of a precursor to what we're trying to pull up here. So I live in Sydney.
I'm sorry. I'm just going to say, Lars, I think you sent me 2 copies of the same one.
What do you think?
Fire the webmaster.
I think, it's on its way.
Okay.
I should add, Lars reached out to me. Lars has been with me now. Lars, when did you first jump in? 2019.
It's gonna be a few years back now.
I got this email from this crazy Swede one day, or maybe I was the crazy one, and he's like, he's like, listen, what you're doing is batshit crazy, but I think I want to be part of this. And I said, okay, well,
I had the same response, Lars.
I said, I really need a website, And I don't think I even finished saying the word website, and he had a mock-up within days. And then, yeah, that was it. So if you visit our website at thelogbookproject.com, everything you see there was single-handedly built by Lars.
Yeah.
Lars works in the aviation industry and taught me more about my dad than I ever knew. My father did not speak about the Second World War. Lars went through every single line in my father's logbook. And I now have a whole new respect for my father, what he did, and for my life. You know, just think about getting on a plane today and turbulence and things that make us shiver versus getting on one 80 years ago and the technology of the time. I mean, so I have a whole new appreciation for my father as a pilot, what he did. He flew 9 different types of aircraft. Along the way, Lars went and found one of the planes my father flew was a Tiger Moth. Lars found the plane, the very plane that
the plane,
which is now in a private collection out in Wetaskiwin in Canada. And so we wrote off to the owners and we said, listen, if we send you the book, would you just get a photo with the book and the plane? And they said, tell you what, if you send us a book, we'll take it up for a spin. And they did. The plane is still airworthy 80 years later. And it's on YouTube. We have a video of it. They took the plane up, the book up with the plane. And so, you know, things like that people have just outpoured to us on this journey. It's just been one of, you know, you said earlier about, you know, trust. People, when they get the book, they open it and they see pages like Jim's page and his family's legacy. And it just that hits them, the impact. And so people do. People will take that book and drive 300 miles in a day. This has been done just to get signatures. It is, the response to it is, and then of course, when they realize the history that they're holding, they then become terrified and say, okay, how soon can I get this off to the next person, please?
Yeah.
There's a fear factor there as well, which, and yes, we accept that it could disappear. It could vanish at any moment, but it has not. And it's been 7 years. And the circles that we have created, the people we have met, the stories we have shared have been life-changing and enriching in ways that I cannot describe.
I'm going to ask you a difficult question, Nick, and that's going to be, I know it's one that I've been asking for years now, I suppose. What are your plans for the logbook? I mean, do you have an end in view?
The end is going to come. It's coming, I think, pretty quick because the pages are actually filling up. But this today was a wonderful culmination for a couple of things for us, Todd. And I want to really thank you and Glenn and Sean for having us, because we've been grappling with, okay, what are we doing? What are we doing? One of the projects that we're working on is a coffee table book, which you have given us stellar advice on as well. And so Lars's presentation, even as I was looking at it, we were going through it, I was like, my goodness, Lars, this is a template, basically. So we're going to take that, and now that becomes our working model to take that and turn that into a coffee table book with some of the stories. Great, here we are. So that's one thing. And the other thing is this presentation, which I'm looking at the time, I have 5 minutes. Right. So this is the other thing which I'm working on right now, which is a documentary. As I mentioned, I live in St. Lucia, which is in the Caribbean. Now, the thing about when you think about World War II, yes, we know it was spanned the whole globe, and we know it was in the Battle of the Atlantic. We know Europe, we know Asia, Japan, the South Pacific. We know all these exotic places, but nobody really talks about what happened right here where I live, for goodness sake. And so next slide. Well, what did happen was that, so we know, and we know as well, we know that when Pearl Harbor was bombed and America was dragged into this war, that, okay, all of a sudden now, the U-boats were unleashed on your East Coast. And what you see here is all the sinkings on the East Coast. But next slide. What we don't talk about, though, is what happened right here in the Caribbean where I live. Next slide. There is something called the Battle of the Caribbean.
Wow.
This is what the legacy is today. There are over 300 sunk ships in the waters around us. Now, this slide is a little disingenuous in the sense that, these are big dots. And so but I mean, obviously the area is huge, but still the point remains that there are over 300 ships were sunk especially in the early part of the war, as far as America was concerned, because they really didn't have any defenses against what was going on. So next slide. So over the course of the war, the Germans built 1,160 U-boats. 785 were sunk. Total losses 3,000. So the kill rate in the everything was like about almost 4 boats per U-boat sunk. The kill rate in the Caribbean, next slide. For just 11 U-boats, the kill rate was 29. So just think about that in terms of a return on your investment. If I'm German and I know I can send 1 boat out to the Caribbean, guess what? Next slide. So let's see what it looks like visually. So here's a global loss rate through a periscope of 1 down submarine. Next slide. Here's what it looks like in the Caribbean.
Wow.
So, and of course, each of these ships has got a crew on it. It's got oil on it. It's got, you know, what's going on? Why are they targeting the Caribbean? What is it that's special about us? Next slide. Why did they come? Next slide. And so now this is actually a little a video, but here we are at the Caribbean. If you can press play.
Ooh.
Will it play? Let me see. It may not.
I doubt it, actually.
Okay. Well, what this was going to do is zoom in on a little island called Aruba. Aruba is a tiny little island, sits just off of Venezuela. It was Dutch. It belonged to the Dutch. When the war broke out, Aruba was the largest refinery for aircraft fuel. So let's just think about that for a minute.
Wow.
What does that mean to the Battle of Britain? What does that mean for Britain's very survival before the war break, before America gets involved? So Aruba, Trinidad, and Guyana, which is next to Venezuela, Guyana produced a lot of bauxite. You need bauxite to build planes. So you got oil and you got bauxite, and that made it absolutely critical to starving off the war effort to defend in Britain. And I'm watching the clock. So I think we could pretty much wrap up here. So, but essentially in 1942, that was the shipping losses were the highest in any theater of war, right in the Caribbean. And there's a summer, actually let me see, just go couple more slides. Let's get to, these were some of the big players. Keep going. Ironically, Karl Donitz, of course, was the commander of the German U-boats, and when Hitler committed suicide, became the leader of the whole German Reich. And Mr. Ben Ferenc, who's a signatory in the logbook, was the last Nuremberg prosecutor. And I didn't make the connection that Ben Ferenc would have put this man to death, basically, because I think they did execute him and would have firsthand knowledge of him. And I didn't make that connection until it was too late. I'm going to wrap up in 60 seconds. Next slide. Keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. This is, okay, keep going. Right, St. Lucia. No, all right. No, stop. Go back. Right, so where I live, in right here, looking out my window, a U-boat came in one day in 1942 in March and torpedoed both of these ships in the harbor. They both sank to the bottom. Later on, they were patched up and refloated. But go back a slide for a second, because I want to show you just how nuts this was. That's the view out my kitchen window.
That's the view out your kitchen window?
View out my kitchen. That is the mouth of the harbor at Castries, right?
Yeah.
So you could swim that. That's about, I think that's probably, I don't know, 300 meters maybe, right? If you look on the horizon, that's Martinique. Martinique is French, remains French. When Germany invaded Martinique became Vichy. So you want to talk about the front line coming to your doorstep, right?
Yeah.
And so for the rest of the war, throughout 1942 and 43, there was this ebb and flow between Vichy France, these submarines that are cruising around the water, sinking boats, the English and the Americans put in blockades because they're afraid that the German submarines are going to go in. And in fact, they did at various times to get support for whatever they needed. But I will wrap up there because this honestly is a whole presentation in itself. But that just gives you some context. I want to leave you with some context of the hotbed that this place was in 1942. And that is the environment through which Ina Collymore Woodstock sailed, although she sailed the following year, I think, in fairness, by which
43.
time had definitely swapped around, but still, boats were still being sunk. And these are the waters through which people like Ina and my father had to sail through to get to Europe. So thank you for your attention, everybody. Thank you, Todd. Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Lars. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Ina. Thank you, Marguerite. It's been our absolute pleasure to present this to you today. Jump on and see us on Facebook and on the website. And we hope to just continue with the legacies of these amazing people and their stories. Thank you.
Nick Devaux and Lars McKee with the Logbook Project. We put their link to the logbookproject.com in the chat. I'll do it again. What a remarkable history lesson. And just, you found a way to share history in a novel way that brings it to life.
You just need to also, on the last note, there was a suggestion that I full-heartedly agree with, and that's the next year's session is going to be held in Nick's kitchen. Agreed.
We're all going to Nick's kitchen for Veterans Day next year. Absolutely. Henry Shepke says this is not fair. I live in Madison, Wisconsin. Wow. Thank you, guys. Thank you for joining us and sharing just a little bit of the story. I look forward to following up with both of you and with Jim Belcher on the stories that you're all working on. And Nick, your history of World War II in the Caribbean is fascinating to me. Thank you very, very much, you guys. Take care.
Thank you, Todd. Thank you for all you do.
Thank you, Todd.
We are